Shabbat Shalom. There are a lot of strategies that some of us use when we're trying to eat healthy or stop ourselves from making bad food decisions, but I have a secret weapon. And that secret weapon is a hamburger or meat. Now, whenever I find myself, usually it's after like 11 o'clock at night when the willpower is kind of shot at, snacking, cookies, whatever it might be. This last weekend was my wife's birthday, so the house was full of cake and treats. The only surefire way I know to get myself to just stop is if we have a little bit of meat in the house to take a bite. Because then I am what's known in the business as fleishik. I have eaten meat and I can't have dairy again for a good number of hours. For whatever reason, my willpower of this isn't so healthy, I should probably stop eating the birthday cake, is not strong enough to overcome my desire for birthday cake. But whatever my religious willpower is, that muscle group, I just had meat so I can't have dairy, is strong enough to win the day. And I'm not really sure what this says about me. I'll deal with that, some other time in therapy. But I think it says something about the genius of the rabbis and the Torah, which is that we speak in the language of law. The fact that Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo, which we just read. Gail, you read it beautifully this week. Do not have milk after you have meat, or whatever that line might mean. We'll talk about that another time as well. That's a law. It's not it would be nice. It's not a suggestion for dietary health. It is a hard and fast law. And so maybe because of that, it goes into a higher category for me and I'm able to stop. When you look at the Torah, the love language of the Torah is laws. God loves humanity, saves them from the flood. The first thing Noah and his children get after the flood, laws. God chooses a people, the Israelites. How do we know they're chosen? Because they get laws. Lots and lots and lots of laws. The rabbis later want to show their great love of God. So what do? They take God's laws and they add so many more laws. This morning's Parashat Mishpatim is Mishpatim. And that, of course, means in Hebrew, say it with me, laws. Laws are actually a pretty great love language when you think about it. They are about people promising to uphold certain values and live in certain ways that, when done right, reflect those communal values. Laws create trust. I know what you're going to do and you know what I'm going to do because we are both bound by the same laws. Laws create accountability. We know that everyone is playing by the same rules. Laws also make it easier to live the way that we want. When we codify who we want to be or how we want to be in the world through laws, it makes it a little easier for us to follow them, like keeping you away from the sugary sweets. But more than that, laws, communal responsibilities that we are all bound to are what keep us together and allow our society to thrive. This lesson has been known and lived by many, but perhaps few in recent history as much as the 16th President of the United States. Yesterday was President Lincoln's 212th birthday. Happy birthday. When he was 28, he made one of his first recorded speeches at the Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. He spoke to a group of what William Herndon recalled was all the culture and talent of the place, and he spoke in a public forum, knowing his words would be published. The backdrop of this speech, this was a little bit gruesome, was the burning of Francis McIntosh 2 years earlier. McIntosh was already in prison in St. Louis when a mob broke into the jail where he was being held, pulled him from his cell, and burned him alive. Later, a judge tasked with investigating this case, a judge Luke Lawless, you can't make up a last name like that, ruled that because it was a mass action, no individuals could be held accountable. A year later, And about 2 months before Lincoln made his speech, Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist news publisher who covered the McIntosh lynching and railed against slavery, was murdered while trying to stop a mob from destroying his printing press. Now, as a lead-in to this subject, Lincoln names the ill that he sees brewing in America. He says, "There is even now something of ill omen amongst us. I mean the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of the courts, and the worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice." The future president goes on to say that in a world such as this, where the press is under attack for their opinions and mob violence rules the day without being stopped by leaders, he says the government will not be able to stand. Now, Lincoln sees the racial injustice, the anger, the destruction of institutions, the violence in the streets, and he says this is a breakdown of community. It is a breakdown of the social fabric of feeling responsible for one another, and it threatens the institutions that are meant to protect each citizen and be for the public good. In short, he sees the problem as a breakdown of law. The laws are not effective, and they are not reflective of our values, and they're not being followed. So what's his answer? Well, he says the question recurs, how shall we fortify against this? The answer is simple, he says. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country and never to tolerate their violation by others. Lincoln could not be clearer. The law to which he would dedicate his entire life is paramount. It's the thing that holds us together. It's the thing that keeps the individual safe from tyranny. It's the thing that must be molded, shaped, and fought for to guide us all on the right and the true. Now, this is predicated by the law being applied equally and for all. In this week's Torah portion, we read an amazing line. The Torah says that if someone has committed murder, even from my very altar, they shall be taken to be put to death. Now, this is in direct distinction from much of the laws of the ancient world. In the ancient world, the altar of the god was a sort of safe zone. If you were holding on to it, you were fine. The Torah knows this. The Torah is throwing this on its head when the Torah says, no. Even if you are holding on to my altar, the law wins. For other religions, the law is earthly. It's like what's happening down here, and the temple has to be a representation of heaven. So therefore, everyone's got to be safe and okay. But for us, the law is what's paramount. And whatever's going on in heaven is only important as it is reflected by the law. And so someone is taken from the very altar, and that's okay. In fact, Rashi, our 11th century commentary, goes a step further. And Rashi says, when it says to be taken from the altar, it means even if the one who committed the crime is a priest or the high priest, then they're in the middle of performing a sacrifice. The law wins. They can and should be arrested and tried. The Torah is teaching us in no uncertain terms that no one is above the law. Not the high priest, not the prime minister of Israel, not a former president. Anyone can and should be held accountable for their actions. The events of the last few months show us the importance of upholding the laws of our land and society. We want to be a country that is obligated towards one another, that works together to heal together and not tear itself apart. However, we also know that laws are not always perfect. In fact, they themselves can be unjust, tools of oppression. The first chapter of our Parsha enumerates the laws of slavery. It then goes on to talk about an eye for an eye and lex talionis. Lincoln himself said, when I so pressingly urge a strict observance of all the laws, let me not be understood as saying there are no bad laws. nor that grievances may not arise, for the redress of which no legal provisions have been made. I mean to say no such thing. His call is not to blindly follow the laws of the land, but to not cast them aside when they don't work. We need to rewrite them and make them fit the justice that we would see in the world. So what do? We ensure that laws are reflective of our values. And in this, the rabbis give us some blueprints. Eye for an eye seems relatively clear. I poke out your eye, you poke out my eye. See Mo v. Larry and Curly for a further treatment of the subject. However, in the hands of the rabbis, in the Talmud, they all agree that it can't mean that. It must, in fact, mean eye for an eye is some sort of monetary compensation. They all agree and then proceed to trip over themselves, offering reason after reason after reason for why this is true. In all of the legal arguments, one thing becomes clear. There doesn't seem to actually be one reason. It all seems a little bit fabricated. And then along comes Rabbi Yosef ibn Habib, a 15th century Spanish Talmudist. And in his commentary on this part of the Gemara, he says the quiet part out loud. He writes, our commentators explained that anything that we know that it is truth, but there are not clear supports for it from the scripture, the permission is in the hands of every person to justify it and bring proofs. The permission is in the hands of every person to justify it and bring proofs. If we know something to be true, like we don't want to live in a world where everyone's poking each other's eyes out, but the Torah doesn't explicitly say so, it becomes the job of the individual to try and justify what they know to be right, but not by sacrificing the system, by using scriptural proofs. Habib doesn't say, if we don't like it, we ignore it or we give up the Torah. He, like Lincoln, advocates for doing all that we can to make the system reflect what we know to be moral and true. As Americans and Jews, we live in two great societies of law. Are either system as just as they should be? No, of course not. But should we kick over the table and destroy the system? Also, I think not. We need to continue to use the language of law because that is the language that binds us together. It forces us to be better people than perhaps we would be left to our own inclinations. Laws are our love language. Perhaps that's why both civil and Jewish marriages are contracted through legal documents. By allowing myself to be subject to the same laws as you and vice versa, we are making a commitment to one another. It is our job to make sure that those laws reflect what we know to be true, moral, and good. But it is also our job to uphold those laws that they might protect us all and keep us all together. As Lincoln concluded his speech all those years ago about the laws of society, he spoke, upon these let the proud fabric of freedom rest, as the rock of its basis, and as truly has been said of the only greater institution, that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Or to put it in the words of the Torah, we follow the laws we set out for ourselves so that we may long endure in that good land. Because without being bound together, responsible for the welfare of each and every one of us, we cannot hope to stand. Shabbat Shalom.